For a long time, the word mysticism has been almost a joke in the West, although we have been taught that at the heart of the Christian religion have been great mystics and religious poets. If we knew more than that, it was that these people's approach to God was emotional, ecstatic, and that the states of mind they described made ordinary life look pretty unimportant. But our information in a Christian-dominated culture did not include the fact that the emotional road was only one of the traditional and very ancient approaches. Recently, a feeling that the kind of education most of us get is not giving us the information we ought to have has led to curiosity about Eastern cults, Buddhism, gurus of various sorts, or the dozen or so yogas. Since the holy man, the sage, has been no part of our culture for centuries, we have had no yardstick to judge the gurus by. But the more eccentric in behaviour, wildly bearded, and sensational in utterance they are, the more attention they get. In the West, we are preoccupied with money, the gaining and the keeping and the spending of it. And so our biases are likely to let us judge a sage, genuine or not, by whether he takes money, and how much, and by the way he outwardly arranges his life. A man who lives in a damp cave on lentils is considered more holy than one who lives an ordinary life in society. But as a result of so many cults, gurus, crazy diets, people standing on their heads, meditations and mantras, many sincerely curious people have been put off and have retreated into an attitude summarized by this anecdote. "What is your view about inner knowledge?" asked a dervish of a theologian. "I have no patience with it." "And what else?" "It makes me sick." "And what else?" "The idea is revolting." How interesting that a logical and trained mind like yours, when asked for a view on a matter, can only describe 3 personal moods. A Sufi would say that people living in a society where Sufism has been openly at work and respected for what it offers must regard all the attitudes towards mysticism I have described as ill-informed, to say the least. "You will have to learn through that most banal of all things," says the Sufi to the would-be student. "You must learn through ordinary life." He is likely to have nothing to say to people looking for excitements and sensational experiences. A dervish on a journey met a yogi who was trying to plumb the secrets of the animal kingdom. The dervish said that a fish had once saved his life, and the yogi exclaimed, "In all my years of meditation and discipline, I have never approached such depths of knowledge." "Then I trouble with you." After some days, the yogi said, "Now that we know each other better, do please tell me how that fish saved your life." The dervish replied, "Now that we know each other better, I doubt whether it is any use telling you. But I will. I hadn't eaten for 3 days. I was starving. That fish saved my life all right." Sufism works through jokes like this one, through books, lectures, all sorts of everyday activities. A Sufi can be a scientist, a politician, a poet, a housewife, the usherette in the cinema. And they never be known as one, since Sufism may have nothing to do with outward appearance and behaviour. It is in operation all the time, all over the world, in every country. Sometimes openly, sometimes not. The people offering it can be well known, as it were beating a drum to say we are here. Or they may teach secretly. But what, you ask, are they teaching? What is Sufism? In a Persian dictionary, the entry for Sufi goes, in rhyme, Sufi chist, Sufi Sufist. What is a Sufi? A Sufi is a Sufi. This is not a form of coyness. but an acknowledgement of the difficulty of defining something that must be experienced, and in a different way for every person according to his or her state of development. God is love, can be the highest experience man can have. Or it can just be some words scrawled on a poster, carried by a poor old tramp. In between these two are 1,000 levels of experience. How to guide the student from one level to the next is the knowledge of a teacher. As Idris Shah says in his book, The Sufis, man must develop by his own effort towards growth of an evolutionary nature, stabilizing his consciousness. He has within him an essence, initially tiny, shining, precious. Development depends upon man, but must start through a teacher. When the mind is cultivated correctly and suitably, the consciousness is translated to a sublime plane. And as Robert Graves wrote in his introduction to the same book, the earliest known theory of conscious evolution is of Sufi origin. The child's slow progress into manhood, or womanhood, figures as only a stage in his development, for which the dynamic force is love, not either asceticism or the intellect. Now all this is at a far remove from the sort of thinking regarded by us as rational. But it is no odder than things we do believe, or institutions we take for granted. In the West, we all live beside one version or another of Christianity, and believe, or half believe, or have to put up with some pretty bizarre ideas. Perhaps the most useful thing I personally have been invited to do in my own approach towards Sufi study is to find out why I believe the things I do believe, to examine the basis of my ideas. Here is an approach to this philosophy that may seem a long way around. It is to take a look at those great Islamic civilizations that blossomed all over the Near East, Spain, Central Asia, North and West Africa, for 1,000 years or more. In these, Sufism was always a strong visible force, dervishes being kings, soldiers, poets, astronomers, educators, advisors and sages. Sufism is the core of Islam. The contention is that the river of knowledge from beyond the stars that has run since Adam, through Noah and Abraham, and on through 100 wise men and prophets, ran also through Jesus, and then Muhammad. It is not a question of one being better or worse than another, smaller or greater, but of these men being different aspects of the same truth or way, manifesting as divine messengers. Both started world religions. Both fed the inner heart of religion. During early Christianity, this inner knowledge was available, then was lost, or went underground, but it was able to survive the death of Muhammad and his companions, and to illuminate Islam wherever it took root. But it is very hard for us to look in this direction at all. Our history has made it almost impossible. You can try this small experiment. Go down to the nearest paperback bookshop and leaf through the first dozen textbooks on popular astronomy, or the history of art, or meteorology, medicine, psychiatry, archaeology. In each will be found versions of the following statements. Between the decline of Greece and Copernicus, science stagnated in superstition. These temperate latitudes in which all civilization has flowered. Europe, the cradle of civilization. A very common one, this. Or, science is the creation of the Renaissance in Europe. Before Freud, the unconscious did not exist. Jung's theory of the archetype, and so on. This attitude towards European history is always implicit in our scholarship. It is one of the great pillars of our thought. But while Europe lay in the dark for centuries, marvelous civilizations brought some sciences to levels we have not approached, medicine and psychiatry among them. Individually, each one of us may or may not be Christian, but like it or not, we are steeped in Christian history. The centuries-long wars with Islam are done with, but the residual mental blocks, the myopia, the parochialism, still cripple our thinking. Nor is it only Islamic cultures that suffer from our prejudices. When Copernicus and Galileo discovered that the earth went around the sun, this knowledge was not only a commonplace in Islamic cultures, but in darkest Africa, cultures that our scholars are only just beginning to notice, let alone study, taught that the earth was the sun's planet. Long before Lister had to fight the medical hierarchy about germs and infection, African witch doctors were using antisepsis and other advanced medical techniques. It is almost impossible for us to see Europe as it was, a little dark provincial fringe to great civilizations that sent emissaries, advisors, missionaries out of the plenitude of their arts and sciences to help the barbarians. Then Europe came forward, in its particular contribution to human knowledge, technology, and it was a turn of the others to fall back. The newcomer, like an adolescent, has had to believe that he was the first to experience or to understand anything. But already this insularity is beginning to break down. When there has been an area of prejudice in a culture, a dam in the mind, the time of its dissolving is always exciting, one of sudden, unexpected advance. As one researcher put it, it is exactly as if great heaps of treasure were lying about in the open, but we were looking in another direction. We were hypnotized by the words Greece, Rome. But Sufism is not a study of past civilizations. It must be contemporary, or it is nothing. Why is it being offered again in the West now? For the simplest of reasons. Sufism works openly when it can, silently when it must. Even 50 years ago, the churches had so strong a hold on thought and morals that the introduction of its ancient way of thinking would have been impossible. But in an open society, Sufism can be offered openly. And perhaps we can now look calmly at the claim that it is a philosophy that can be hostile to no true religion, since all religions are the outer faces of an inner truth. As for people like myself, unable to admire organized religions of any kind, then this philosophy shows where to look for answers to questions put by society and by experience. Questions not answered by the official purveyors of knowledge, secular or sacred. Man has had the possibility of conscious development for 10,000 years, say the Sufis. This thought shows itself differently in the claim that man is woefully underused, undervalued, and doesn't know his own capacities. I have believed this all my life, and that the idea is central to Sufism is one reason I was attracted to it. Put it this way. In a circus, every child born to a certain family will become a wonderful acrobat. Is this because these children have acrobats' genes, or because they are expected to be acrobats? The implications shatter our assumptions about education. I must have read hundreds of manuscripts in my time. Very early on, I saw that these authors have every bit as much talent as I have. All writers' early efforts are very similar. But some writers go on writing. Others fall out. We live in a society where we all think in terms of success or failure. I am sure that the manifold talents, creativity, inventiveness of young children, who can sing and dance and draw and tell tales and make verses, and whose view of life is so very clear and direct, could go on into adult life and not disappear, as tends to happen in our system of education. We see as quite different the process of intense concentration of the scientist or artist that results in flashes of extraordinary achievement. Telepathy, second sight, hunches, the intimations of dreams. But these are seen by the Sufis as manifestations of the same thing, the first stirrings of this evolving part of humanity. But it is easy to waste this potential, for instance, by using drugs to stimulate the brain, or by self-induced ecstasies. It is only those who taste who can know, say the Sufis, reiterating that this experience is not a question of intellectual development. Every person comes to a point when the need is felt for further inner growth. Then it is wise to look for the guide, the teacher, the exemplar, that figure central to Sufism who shows others what is possible. This person, the product of a certain kind of varied and intensive education, will be master not of one trade but of a dozen, learned through pressures of necessity created by the people by whom he has been surrounded since birth, people whose duty it is to see that he fulfill all his capacities. The child will be protected from the narrowing and the littling of ordinary education, from the idea that a person can be a tinker or a tailor, but not both, or, if both, then he is to be congratulated on his versatility. In Sufism, the notion of two cultures is non-existent. The idea that the arts and the sciences must be hostile, absurd. Of the great figures who have successfully combined mathematics and poetry, and much else, perhaps Omar Khayyam is best known in the West. The products of Sufi schools are people who are prodigies from our point of view. Our forms of education produce nothing like them. People who, in our violent time, get whirled out of their little ruts through different countries, climates, ideas, languages, who have had to learn to earn their living in varied ways, who lose the arrogance of class and race, are more likely to approach the Sufic idea of the whole man. Idris Shah, who is bringing Sufism back into the West now, is a product of this intensively varied education. He has been living in Britain for 15 years, and in that time has re-established Sufism as a visible, vital force. As examples of his many-sidedness, he has patented scientific devices. He has been journalist, explorer, traveller, has studied archaeology, geology, economics, politics. He writes books on travel, anthropology, magic, Sufism, each unique in its field. He writes Sufic fables and stories of his own. He has written a prize-winning film script. He corresponds in Arabic, Persian, English, French, Spanish, with experts in a dozen different fields. He has just helped to decipher and to have performed ancient Egyptian music unheard by man for 3.5 millennia. He is a husband, the father of 3, and runs from his home the Institute for Cultural Research, which has hundreds of members and is in vigorous operation. 3 years ago he started a publishing firm which has already put out a dozen books, all successful. But he would say, perhaps it is not me, but your ideas about the possibilities of man that are extraordinary, and refuses to be treated as a guru. But it doesn't do to say that a man, or a book, or an institution is Sufism, which, while it is essentially something always the same, is always taking different forms. As an old Sufi put it, when a Sufic form arises, many people will fail to recognize it. These are Sufi formalists who copy techniques and believe that this is the same as the way. Since the form belongs to time, like an old cloak, those who simply emulate old forms will be unable to recognize the forms of the actual time in which they live. The recent visible reintroduction of Sufism into Britain, in print, was not in the intellectual or specialist journals, but in the Times, Blackwood's magazine, the Contemporary Review, and a woman's magazine called The Lady, and were not recognized by most of the Orientalists and would-be experts. Those who are more likely to recognize a Sufi current are those with noses for the fresh and the lively. And this thing might be anything from a person or a book, a sharply angled statement by a physicist at a conference, the attitude of a politician, a new trend in fashion, a poem, a play, to a garden planted and tended in a certain way. The way Sufism is being taught in Britain now differs from what happens in Morocco or Afghanistan, Greece or South America. The teachers and the institutions containing Sufism for this time are different from those in the past, and always changing. If you encounter two institutions calling themselves Sufi, exactly the same, then one of them must be a fake, says a Sufi teacher. Another old teacher, who was called the Lord of the Skies, said, "Almost all the men who come to see me have strange imaginings about man. The strangest of these is the belief that they can progress only by improvement. Those who will understand me are those who realize that man is just as much in need of stripping off rigid accretions to reveal the knowing essence as he is of adding anything. Those who are really the wise know that the teaching may be carried out also by exclusion of those things which make man blind and deaf." Before you can even start on Sufi study, you must first try, as one is told again and again, to learn how to learn, and everything is unexpected. Sometimes, when we look back over our lives, we may think, "I learned more through that experience than in all the rest of my life put together." And the experience may be a tough job of work, or a phase of a marriage, a serious love, an illness, a nervous breakdown. This way of learning, a time of crammed, thoughtful living, is perhaps nearer to the learning of the Sufi way than any other.